Hello, it's Ruby, and in today's video I want to talk about how you can start reading the classics. It's a question that I get very frequently. People who are really interested to read the classics and really want to read the classics but don't really know where to start and are possibly a little bit daunted by classics. You know, it's this capitalised thing, classics with a capital C, which is daunting because of the way that we talk about it and the way that we talk about classics as being difficult and hard and inaccessible, and obviously that puts people off. I know that it's put me off certain classics and authors before. So in this video, I thought we could talk about some ways that you can start reading classics and ways that you can reshape the narrative around classics for yourself so that you can actually genuinely enjoy them. The absolute most important thing is to get rid of the preconception that classics are difficult and hard and maybe even boring. If you go into it thinking, I'm not going to enjoy this, then you're much less likely to enjoy it. The way that we approach something, the lens through which we look at something, is going to affect the way that we interact with that thing. And I think the core thing with classics to remember is that classics are classics and remain classics because they were popular at a particular moment in history. Like, most classics were incredibly popular at the time that they were published, and a lot of classics were actually very controversial when they were published. They were books which were kind of for the people and which literary critics at the time said, this is not valuable literature, this is not something that good members of society should be reading. Just a few examples are Wuthering Heights, which was so incredibly controversial when it was published. It was this scandalous story about this very improper relationship between two immoral characters, and there were people who were crying out for this book not to be sold. Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy is another one. It was thought to be way too critical. It was thought to include too much protest against class distinctions, and the criticism was so strong that Thomas Hardy didn't write another novel after that one. Then of course there's Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was famously an author of the people. He wrote for like everyday people in London, and when his books were first written, they weren't published as books, as novels like we know them today. As in, A Tale of Two Cities was not published like this, but instead it was serialised, and a new chapter came out each week in magazines. And magazines, of course, are so much cheaper to buy than books, especially at a time where books were very expensive. In fact, people say that Charles Dickens was the first celebrity author. There was a massive mania around Charles Dickens. People absolutely adored him, and there is even a story of somebody taking a lock of Charles Dickens's hair, and when he went to America especially, he would do these public readings, and there would just be hordes of people who were out there like cheering for him, supporting him. Shakespeare is another example. Shakespeare is now what we would consider the height of English literature and the classics and the most prestigious name when we're talking about English literature, and yet Shakespeare, again, even though his plays were very much loved, they weren't considered scholarly in the way that we would consider them today. Someone like Ben Jonson was much more respected for literary merit at the time than Shakespeare, even though Shakespeare has gone on to be much more prolific and famous. And these are just a few examples. There are so many classics which follow this trend. Classics become classics because they've been very, very popular and because they've been loved at a historic moment. And I think, like, approaching books with that understanding, with that knowledge, and knowing that these books have been so beloved by so many people, I think it like instantly makes them feel a bit more accessible. And I think it helps to reframe their value as not being about like the fact that they're classics, but rather that they are such important books that they've withstood the test of time. So that is my first tip. My second tip is to not treat these books as classics when you read them. When you pick up a book like The Picture of Dorian Gray, don't pick it up as a classic. Of course you know it's a classic, of course you know that it has this status as a classic, but I would say read it like any other book. By like stressing to yourself that it is a classic, and by repeating like this phrase, oh, this is a classic book, I think you end up approaching the book with a set of preconceptions. I've spoken with people before who've said, the classics aren't meant for me, they're too difficult, they're too hard, I'm not going to understand them. And you might not feel like this, but if you do feel like that about classics, approaching this book with the understanding and with the kind of emphasis on the fact it's a classic inadvertently might mean that you don't like end up reading it with a clear head, and you don't end up enjoying it as much as you otherwise would. Point 3 is again related, but when you start reading classics, I would very much discourage annotation and note-taking. Don't read these books like classics, read them like books, read them like any other book that you'd want to read. For a lot of us, our main interactions with classics happen at school. They've been in a classroom, and when you're studying a book in a classroom, you are taking notes all of the time. Everything is a big discussion, everything is kind of a critical conversation, and that's wonderful, and I love discussing books in this way, but it is a very different way of reading to like how you would read for pleasure if you were reading a novel in your free time. And so even though these classics can be discussed so well, and even though you could take reams and reams of notes on them, I would recommend, if you're getting started with classics, to just focus on reading it as you would any other book. It's about reframing your perspective for enjoyment rather than study. So, for example, about a year and a half ago, I reread Comus by John Milton, which is one of my favourite pieces of literature. And even though I love this masque so much, it ended up taking me a really long time to read because I wanted to take detailed notes on it. So every time I'd go to read it, I'd get out all of my pens, I'd get out, post-it notes, and I'd sit down at a desk or a table. And even though I really liked reading it, there was some level of resistance because I knew it was a task as opposed to just quickly dipping into a book. And if you're just getting into classics, you just want to avoid that resistance as much as you can. Okay, number 4. Don't be afraid to watch the film first. There is so much flack given to people who watch the film before reading the book. And by and all, I am someone who would rather read the book and then watch the film. But sometimes with classics, I do think the film can help you appreciate and enjoy the book, because film adaptations are always critical interpretations. It's, you're converting the story into a different medium, and every decision that a director makes, every decision that an actor makes is a critical interpretation of the original text and of that book. And so in some ways you could say that watching a film version of a book is akin to reading a critical paper or like an opinion piece on the book before reading it. It might change the way you read it, but it could also help you to enjoy the material and like see things in the material that you otherwise wouldn't see. So, for example, it's no secret that historically I have not liked Jane Austen at all, but the film adaptations of Jane Austen allowed me to enjoy reading her books. In 2020, I watched the Sense and Sensibility adaptation with Emma Thompson in, and I loved it. And I loved it so much that I thought I need to give the book a go, and I did, and I really enjoyed it. I also watched the 2020 Emma film before reading Emma, and watching the film first really helped me pick up on the humour in this, which meant I really liked it. Jane Austen's humour is very subtle. She is very sarcastic, sardonic, but when I'd read Jane Austen in the past, I hadn't picked up on that humour. When I watched the film adaptations, I could see it, which meant I could pick it up in the books, which meant I enjoyed them a lot more. And so by watching the film first, it could help you to enjoy the book more when you read it. And then the final tip is to read a nice copy of a classic. The great thing about reading classics is there are so many different editions you can choose from. Like hundreds of them, sometimes even thousands of them. And so you can choose a really beautiful one. You can go on eBay and you can find a really gorgeous, like kind of vintage copy of a book. So this is a lovely copy of Pericles, for example. I think reading like a beautiful copy like this, it adds to the experience of reading, and it can make the reading experience more enjoyable. I'm a big believer in that. I'm not someone who's against aesthetics when it comes to books. In fact, I think the book object and the text can really complement each other. And this kind of goes against everything I've said just now about reading them like any other book that you would read. It becomes this beautiful experience. And when you hold this book and you let yourself read from such a book, it creates importance for yourself, and it kind of creates an experience for yourself. You create this lovely ritual and narrative around the experience of reading. And if the act of reading becomes this enjoyable, lovely thing, then maybe that can help you to enjoy the text that you're actually reading, if that makes sense. I do think there is something there. Those are some general ideological tips on how to enjoy classics, but what should you actually read if you want to get into classics? And there are 3 subsections which I think we should talk about, and those are children's classics, short stories, and novels. I think children's classics are a great place to start if you want to get into classic literature, because by reading historic children's books, you can get more used to the language which is used in classics, like the slightly antiquarian patterns of speech and dialect, which will then make it easier to read others. So some amazing children's classics you might want to try are Little Women, A Little Princess, The Secret Garden, Anne of Green Gables, The Little Prince, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, Ballet Shoes, the Narnia books. There really are so many great ones, and I have been promising, I keep on saying that I'm going to film a video with all of my favourite children's classics, so I will do that at some point very soon. The second thing which is great for getting into classics is short stories, because a short story is a lot less intimidating than a 600-page novel. By reading short stories, again, you're getting used to the patterns of speech and you're getting used to that form of writing, but you're not committing to something absolutely huge. And also short stories are great for finding classical authors that you really will enjoy the work of. The Penguin Little Black Classics are a great choice for this because you can try out a load of famous authors and see which author's writing you like the most, and then you could try a novel by one of those authors. Some short stories that I would recommend though are Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville, The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, and The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. They're just a few that you might want to start with. And then number 3, finally, of course, is novels, which is kind of the main thing people think of when they think of reading the classics. And there are definitely some classics which are better ones to start with. If you want, I can film a video with maybe 20 or 30 classics to start with, so let me know if you want to see that. But some options would be To Kill a Mockingbird, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, Hard Times by Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Those are just a few classics which I think are great if you're just getting into classic literature. But there are so many, and do let me know if you want a video kind of pitching maybe 20 or 30 classic books. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that it was helpful in making classics feel a little less daunting or getting you excited about reading classics. If you have any follow-up questions, then please do just ask, because I do actually really care a lot about people reading more classics. One thing that can really upset me is when people say I can't read classic books because they're not for me. That's something I've got from quite a few different people, and that makes me really sad because these can be very, very great stories, and they're often classics for a reason, as I say, because they've been so beloved by people historically. And hopefully some of these tips are helpful for just reminding you that these books are for you, and I really hope that you think about giving a classic a go. Anyway, thank you so much again, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week.